This is a unique, if tenuous time for India, India Inc. rather. On the one hand, the world is interested in India's growth story, and Indian firms are more outward looking in their approach. But when India Inc. looks abroad, it also sees uncertainty, rising geopolitical tensions, and the threat of military conflict. How do you see the international environment playing out in the next decade?
Yeah, thank you, Neil. And it's always a hard act to follow the finance minister, but I'll try. I think everyone, the finance minister herself and somebody from the audience also spoke of the VUCA factor. And really, if we want to understand the world today, we have to understand that we are going through not one, but two transitions at the same time. One is a millennial transition. It's happening once in several centuries. And that is the world's center of gravity in economics is returning back to the Indo-Pacific after almost half a millennium in the Northern Atlantic. This is a once in a millennium change, and we are at the heart of that change. India is at the heart of that change, and therefore there is a massive opportunity we have. But a second transition is also taking place, and that is the fragmentation of the global political and economic order that the United States built after the Second World War, right? So you have the United Nations credibility at its lowest in 7 decades, and this is the only global institution which makes rules for maintaining peace and stability in the world. So you see the Security Council unable to resolve 2 major conflicts taking place in Ukraine and in Palestine. The Bretton Woods institutions are unable to maintain the sort of global economic order, and the WTO as well, principally because it is not able to accommodate the emerging economies which are now increasingly playing a major role in the world. So you have a fragmentation of the global economic order. Technologically, there are no laws. We are in a lawless world when it comes to outer space, underwater, cyber, and all these new technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and so on. And the organizing principle at the end of the 20th century, which was that democracy was the only form of governance which could give both economic stability and national security, is being questioned now by your northern neighbor, which says, look at me, you don't have to be a democracy to give benefits to your people. So we are faced both with an opportunity because of where we are located and a set of challenges because the world's order is fragmenting. Now, just want to add one final point, and that is some people think fragmentation is good because it leads to a more multipolar world. But I have a different approach, or a slightly different approach, because we have to look at the facts on the ground, right? If you look at GDP, and I'm talking World Bank figures, the United States is at $23 trillion, China at $18 trillion, give or take $1 trillion, depending on how much you trust their statistics. The next 5 global economies, globally large economies, which is India, Japan, Germany, UK, and France, collectively have a GDP less than China. And if you look at defense spending, which is another important indicator of world power, then the United States spends $800 billion, China about $400 billion, and the next 5 countries, India, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Britain, and France, spend less than China. So to my mind, what multipolar world are we talking about? We are talking of a multilateral world where on an individual issue more than 2 countries might weigh in, but we are living in a multilateral world with very strong bipolar features. And this is a situation which is going to persist for the next 15 years. So we have to work within these realities to become not only a 10 trillion or a $30 trillion economy, whichever number we wish to place, but also a major power in this world.
This leads in very nicely to my next question, which is about that bipolar dimension to this world. A significant driver of economic uncertainty and tension is the strained relationship between America and China. You know both parties reasonably well. Is there any chance of détente in the future?
I think the relationship between the United States and China is witnessing some structural problems. The fact is the United States did not anticipate when they opened up to China in the late 1970s that China would become a real challenger so quickly. This is not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a military challenger but economically weak. You here are dealing with a country which is both militarily strong and economically viable as a major economy. So the United States has the problem of not allowing a peer competitor to overcome its role as the world's major power. And on the other hand, China is determined to achieve that goal. So what you have is a structural competition, and because I think it's still a bipolar, not a bipolar world, but a multilateral world with bipolar features, you are going to see a hardening of the industrial chains by both countries and technological firewalls which are going to force the rest of us to choose between them. Now, ordinarily, I think India is in a good position. We're a large country, a growing economy, our demographics are good, and therefore one would think that we are better off than practically every other country in the world in navigating this difficult situation between the two major powers. But the one point which I think we perhaps have not focused on, and we should, is the possibility of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. The Taiwan Strait is not just an ordinary hotspot in the Asia Pacific. There are others including India, Pakistan, North Korea, South China Sea and so on. But this hotspot is different. It's an existential problem for both countries. As China seeks to dominate the world, it finds it intolerable that a small island 100 miles off its coast remains out of its grip. So it's a matter of prestige. It diminishes China's prestige in the world. And as far as the United States is concerned, to the extent that Taiwan is lost, the United States loses the label of being the defender of the free world. So for both, it is an existential problem, and they are going to hunker down in an effort to ensure that the other side does not win. Now, the reason I'm flagging this is we seem to think we are 5,000 miles away and it won't make a difference. But it is going to make a massive impact on the Indian economy if there is a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. And I'm not talking war, because if there's a war, it's going to be a third world war. It's not going to be limited to the Taiwan Strait. I'm talking of a general crisis, rise in tension, possible blockade, disruption of trade and so on, right? I think there are 4 ways in which you're going to get very badly impacted. 50% of Indian shipping passes through the Malacca Strait and the Taiwan Strait. So any exporting industry, as well as any industry dependent on Chinese supply chains, are going to get massively affected if there is a blockage in either the Malacca or the Taiwan Strait. So that strait-off has a knock-on effect on the Indian economy and second-order effects on us as well. But bigger than that is that your semiconductors come entirely from that region: Japan, South Korea, China and Taiwan. Any disruption in supplies for a country of which 54% of our GDP comes from services means a massive knock-on effect on e-commerce, e-logistics, entertainment, education, practically anything, e-governance, practically anything that is digital. And finally, since we pride ourselves on IT, information technology enabled services, 15 of the major cables that go from India's Silicon Valley to the US Silicon Valley are anchored off the Taiwanese coast. Any disruption in those submarine cables and your IT industry will take a massive hit. And by the way, China cut one of the cables between one of the small Taiwanese islands and the main island in March and said, sorry, we didn't mean to do so. So that means we have to presume that both major powers have the capability to damage submarine cables as well. So if we aren't paying attention to this, and I hope the government is, then I think at least industry and business ought to start paying attention, because if not, we will be caught napping. And the Taiwan problem has to be resolved one way or the other. It is intolerable for the Chinese that it will be dragged on for another century. It cannot be dragged on for another century. We can all hope for a peaceful solution, but we have to prepare for the worst there.
So Vijay sir, India-China trade has continued to remain high even as the rest of the bilateral relationship remains frozen. Do you believe that the government has done enough to guarantee its economic security vis-a-vis China? Is this a vulnerability for India?
Well, I'm not in the government. You'll have to ask the government that question. But what I can say is I think it's very naive for those people who think that just because we have poor relations with China, we can simply switch on and switch off our trade relationship. In the first place, China does dominate trade not only with us, but practically every other country in the world because it manufactures 25 to 30% of everything in the world today. Secondly, we seem to forget that most of our best performing export sectors are heavily dependent on the Chinese supply chains. The finance minister spoke of pharmaceuticals. That's an obvious case. Our pharmaceutical exports would collapse if China stops exporting APIs to India. But your telecom industry, your electronics industry, a lot of other industries where capital goods come from China are heavily dependent at the moment on China. So simply cutting off trade is cutting off your nose to spite your face. What the government, I presume, is doing and perhaps has to some extent been able to do is to look at sectors where we can build capacity so that we reduce our imports from China. And in certain other cases, look at alternative points of import so that our industry is not entirely dependent on Chinese supply chains. But I think in this day and age, to imagine that we will completely decouple from China, or that the United States and China will completely decouple from each other is impossible in a globalized world. It cannot be done. We should not be doing it. But what we should be doing is insulating our strategic industries and building up strategic capacity where our core industries are affected. And I think that's the PLI scheme and various other schemes government has is basically oriented to that direction.
We had a panel earlier where Indian MNCs were talking about their overseas forays. So in that context, I asked, with geopolitical tensions increasing, do Indian companies need a foreign policy?
I have no doubt that Indian companies need a foreign policy for the simple reason that if you look at the course of human history, no major power has risen in the world unless they have looked outwards. I don't mean in military terms. I think that's a historical anomaly which will not come back again. You don't go out and conquer other lands. But from the Roman Empire onwards to the American Empire, great empires have existed only when you have a strong external presence. And that external presence is not simply a diplomatic or military presence, it is primarily an economic presence, a presence that is built by our industries and companies. And to do that, I think particularly in this VUCA world, every company needs a strategy. We all thought that after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, there was no real need for geopolitical understanding anymore. It was just geoeconomics. But of course, that was a myth because ultimately countries compete with each other and nothing is stable in the world. It's always in a permanent transition. So if we are to bring geopolitics back in, then I think every company needs a foreign policy because you need to know where to go, how to invest, what the risks of investment are. And if you don't have in-house capability, you have to support think tanks and institutions the way the Americans and the Chinese do today to get that sort of information from them which will allow companies to make informed decisions. I worry sometimes that our business does not step up to the plate there. In fact, India is perhaps the only rising or major power where the think tank community is starved of funds and where outstanding young researchers have to leave academics and go in to look for other jobs because there's no money to be made in, say, doing a report saying why our industry should be worried about a crisis in the Taiwan Strait.
Now, this is the year of elections, and probably in terms of foreign elections, the one that we are watching the most is the US one. So what impact can that have on India, depending on who wins?
Yeah, well, since 1945, every single American election, of course, has a global impact because they are the dominant player in the world. But I think the 2024 election is going to be perhaps the most significant in half a century. And that is because it is not just between the Republicans and the Democrats. It is between that group of people which believe that the international political and economic order that the Americans have built is worth further investing in because it benefits America, and those people have lined up behind President Biden. And the growing number of Americans who feel that enough blood and treasure has been spent without commensurate benefit, and that it is time for America to look after itself, and they are lining up behind former President Trump. And if President Trump gets elected again or re-elected, and America becomes a more isolationist, then what we have to presume is that the global order will fragment even more quickly than it is fragmenting today. And if that happens, then it will have a deep impact on India. So I think at a global level, we all have to really look at this election very, very closely. But if President Trump comes to power, we also have to understand that while on the national security side, our relations with the United States may continue to be stable, we are going to go for a very difficult time in terms of trade. If you have not read, I urge you to read a book by Trump's former trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, called No Trade is Free. He wrote it last year. India figures very, very prominently in that book as a country with high tariffs and unwillingness to open markets for American goods. And he mentions specific sectors in that, including pharmaceuticals, jewelry, and so on and so forth. And there are a number of sectors, right? But Lighthizer was one of the few cabinet officials who did not criticize Trump after the 6th of January incident in on the Capitol, is almost certain to get a very major position in the White House, possibly Treasury Secretary or Chief of Staff. And therefore, India is very much in the firing line on all matters economic if Trump comes to power. So I think Indian industry has to begin thinking of it, because at least my understanding is there's a 50-50 possibility that he'll come to power. So you have both to worry about a further fragmentation of the global order as America isolates, and a direct impact on trade policy if Trump comes to power.
I'm afraid I have to take you back to China once more. My next question is about how China depends on its public sector companies to act as outposts across the world. Does India have a strategy, especially in sensitive countries?
No, I don't think that we can follow the same strategy as China. You know, in China, the public sector is part of the government, but all heads of the Chinese public sector are all senior ranking members of the Communist Party. And under the current president, there is very little separation, if at all any, between the party and the state. Therefore, it becomes easy for the state to support the public sector. In India, you can't do that. First of all, the public sector is autonomous. In many cases, they are publicly listed companies. In the second place, I think the government wants to some extent divest or not be so heavily invested in the public sector and allow the private sector to prevail. Therefore, supporting the public sector as a set of companies is difficult, but in individual cases, defense contractors, for instance, or some of the Navaratnas, it's possible that government will give support. Nevertheless, I think, as the finance minister also said, they expect the public sector to become competitive, and I think that's the direction to go in.
Okay, I'll ask one final question before we head into the audience round. And that is from the point of view of us as investors, as global investors. You've tracked China extremely closely, and the market there seems to have wiped out more than a decade's worth of gains. The economy is very down. There is a trend towards authoritarianism in China. Do you see any green shoots, or it's all quite bleak?
You know, I'm not one of the, I was at a conference in Stanford a couple of months ago, and somebody in the audience asked me what I thought of a declining China. And I said, I don't see any declining China. From India, it's still a rising China, and it will be for our lifetime. We need to be clear about that. A country which has added $1 trillion in GDP to the economy every single year from the year 2000 to the year 2017 is not a Potemkin economy. It's a real economy we're dealing with. And if there are headwinds in that economy in the last 5 or 6 years, it doesn't mean that that growth potential has in any way over the long term been affected. Now, of course, China is not going to grow at 5 or 6% per annum anymore. It can't on an $18 trillion base. But whatever it adds even at 2 and 3%, let's be realistic, is more than India is going to add at 8%. So the gap is still going to continue to widen until it starts shrinking if we grow at 8% for 10 or 15 years consistently. And since I'm not in the government, I don't believe in wishful thinking. I think we have to think of the here and now, not what might happen 15 years later, right? Now, that's not to say there aren't headwinds in the Chinese economy. There are very serious structural problems. First and foremost, of course, falling demographics, and that's a policy disaster. What we thought was a wonderful policy has now turned out to be a bad idea. And that means consumption it falls. Now, to a certain extent, demographics are made up by robotics or other forms of AI, but robots don't consume. So that's the first problem. The second is clearly the growth was so sort of pushed by property and infrastructure that has reached its limit. And that's a problem because the state budgets essentially were funded by land sales revenue. The moment nobody is buying property or building infrastructure, land sales fall as well. So state budgets shrink. And therefore, the state's ability to grow the economy shrinks as well. So that's the second problem. The third is domestic consumption is not taking place precisely when you want it to take place, simply because as the Chinese citizenry grow anxious about what's going to happen 20 years later, the tendency is to save now and not to spend. Whereas the government wants you to spend and not to save. By the way, I agreed with almost everything that the finance minister said, but the one point I think we should flag is rising consumption is, a rising middle class and rising consumption is not necessarily a correlation, because otherwise China would be a growing economy. So we have to be very careful. Simply because there is a rising middle class in India from 7 crores to 100 crores doesn't mean there'll be rising consumption, right? We have to be careful about that. But, and China is a typical case. So what we have are a number of structural problems that are there. But let's not forget they are at the cutting edge of every single sunrise industry, in some cases ahead of the United States. And they're banking on that, and that's the world of the future. They've invested heavily in R&D, they've invested heavily in education, and therefore I don't buy the theory that the Chinese economy has stagnated or peaked. It's slowed down, that's part of the natural process. It will encounter headwinds, but I don't think we should ever imagine, at least in our lifetimes, that the Chinese economy is simply going to disappear, or that it's not going to be a major part of the world's economy. What I worry about is that we as Indians don't have enough understanding of the internal politics of China. And like the rest of the world, we presume that this situation, this stable governance will continue for years and years ahead. History tells us that practically no authoritarian regime lasts for a century. It's very rare for it to last beyond a century. And 2 red flags have gone up for me in the last 2 years, which I think we all should worry about. In November 2022, there was a catastrophic collapse of the COVID-19 policy. We all saw the way it collapsed. In India, it was a gradual weaning off the process. In China, it catastrophically collapsed one day because a few thousand people came on the street. Now, that doesn't worry me. What worries me is that a state which has the most sophisticated surveillance capabilities in the world could not judge the mood of its people. And if it cannot judge the mood of its people once, then it may not be able to judge the mood of its people the second time, and the second time around, a few 100,000 may come on the road. So I think for me, that's a red flag. The second red flag was last year. The entire strategic nuclear command of China, the top leadership was removed for corruption. Now, for a president who has for 10 years been hunting down the corrupt to the extent of jailing a number of his colleagues in the military, in the civilian side, and on business, I find it astounding that he has not been able to create that much fear that the entire nuclear command of the army has to be dismissed overnight, which leads me to believe that there is still strong opposition and dissent to the president within the country we don't see, and that might surface. Because no Chinese leader from 1949 until now has ever been able to wipe out dissent. So for me, there are red flags we should be watching. I don't think we have enough expertise in the country on what's happening inside China. But one day, if something happens there, it will have a huge global impact simply because it's an $18 trillion economy and we depend on everything from vitamin C to the storage battery in our new EV on China.
All right, technically our time's up, but maybe one audience question. All right, there's a hand there.
You go first.
Yeah, sir, we all know what China is doing from a border perspective, but what is your view in terms of the cyber threats from China? Cyber threats from China.
I can't answer that question. I'm not an expert in that area.
Maybe I can go. Ranjini here from the middle. You mentioned the Taiwan issue and how the Indian state as well as the industry in general should be prepared for probably a conflict. What would you advise that the Indian state do? What do you think we should do? What is Indian play there? And what can the industry do as well?
Yeah, well, I think diplomatically we carry a very substantial weight around the world. So well before a crisis occurs, I think it should be our responsibility to tell a number of other countries in the world what an impact that will have on their economies. Most countries don't realize, they don't imagine what sort of an impact will come on their economy if the United States and China have a problem. If you go to the rest of the world and tell them the US and China are going to have a problem, they don't care. But if you tell them the US-China problem is going to result in joblessness in your country or a sharp fall in GDP growth or a shutdown in industries, believe me the entire international community will take cognizance. And therefore, if we can build up a core, a sort of sense globally that this is a problem that all of us don't wish to see, then it brings pressure on both China and the United States not to attempt an adventurous policy in that area. But domestically, at least what I think should be done is that the government of India should be having a sort of review across the board of every single ministry and department which is in some way or the other dependent on China to see where the risk is. Now, we tend to think the obvious ministries are finance, commerce, home, defense, that's fine. But even ministries like education, culture, social welfare are going to be affected simply because all your e-governance programs will be affected if there's a problem. So I think what we really should be doing is making a stress test in every department and ministry of the government of how much it will come under stress if either Chinese exports or Chinese supply chains or Chinese semiconductors or the submarine cables are disrupted. And then begin to see what alternatives should be put in place to try and insulate those segments or those sectors from that, from the stress that might come. Now, it's not that difficult to do if you put your mind to it. It has to be done as a priority. But that starts with the realization that if there's a problem in the Taiwan Strait, there will be a problem in India. If that realization is not there, nothing is going to get done.
So, first of all, thank you. I mean, your China thing actually so well articulated. In fact, I must say that I should not exaggerate if I say that I have got goosebumps. I mean, the fact that China has been able to get away with murder like COVID, spreading COVID across the world, and still I don't know whether India is leveraging. Can you see me here? I'm here. I'm just asking you a question. So I'm just trying to tell you that the way you articulated China scenario was absolutely amazing. I have not seen any strategist talking about it so well. So the thing that I wanted to draw out from there is India doing enough to leverage the global situation wherein its own strategic interests are secured? I mean to say, can we depend upon USA, which is just using as a strategic tool against China in the form of Quad and other things, But when we have a difficult situation, will it help like Russia did in 1971? And China is very close to, Russia, and Russia is also, going to be very, very strategically involved with China in terms of, Ukraine war and other things. So because they need Taiwan, so they need Russian help. Okay. So given the global emerging scenarios, the way China is aggressively going ahead in terms of, spying on India, and then even in US, they're buying up a lot of land next to the all the fighter pilots, wherever the fighter planes are there, So in a very scheming and with a more spying scenario, the way they are trying to do the hegemony, do we, with such a big country which is a more population than China, are we having our act right in terms of using our own aggressive tactics? I know Ajit Doval is a good strategist, but are we having our own strategic think tank in alignment so that we are able to contain China?
Yeah, well, I'm a bit biased in that regard because I was a foreign secretary with this government. So pardon my being a little biased. I think the policy that the current external affairs minister has articulated, which is multi-alignment, is the only way you can go. I think we are a large country, but we need to leverage the advantages with all the major countries, and that includes the United States, the European Union, Japan, China, where it suits us, and Russia. And I think we are going down that road. And I think there's a clear understanding in the government that at the end of it all, you stand alone. If there is, for instance, a problem we have with China, God forbid, down the road, I don't think any other country is really going to come to your help. That's not the way it works. And I think there is a clear understanding in the government on that. That is not something that worries me. What worries me is the debate that we had around 2018 or 19, and this is just an illustrative example of Huawei, that the Chinese company which makes the phones, right? The view was that Huawei was somehow an intrusive technology that we should not get into, which is fine because perhaps it is. But my only point is that any other technology you buy from outside is also equally intrusive. Both are equally capable. It's only one might have a worse intention than the other. It's not as if the Europeans or the Americans don't snoop on us either. In fact, their history of snooping, industrial espionage is far better and bigger than China's. So the real debate is not our concern with China. The real debate is, are we as a country which is big geographically, demographically and economically willing to take and make our own technology rather than choose between the United States and China. That is the debate which we should be having in this country. Because frankly, if we can't make our own stuff, technologically speaking, then there is no difference between the 19th century and the 21st century. We are a big market. It's just that in the 19th century, you were importing textiles from Manchester and Leeds, and in the 21st century, it's a choice of importing telephones, mobile phones from the United States or China. So I think that's the debate we should have. Where are we on R&D and S&T and on innovation, and what is government doing to see that those million startups actually scale up into a Google, a Meta, or a Facebook, and not on whether we should be using Chinese technology or American technology or such like. So I think multi-alignment is a tactical policy. It's a good policy. It's being well implemented. But I think a deeper debate is needed in Indian society on how we can ourselves become global leaders in technology rather than simply choosing between whatever is available in the marketplace.
All right, I'm sorry, I think that's it in terms of time. We already run out.
Yes.
Vijay sir, thank you very much.